Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on BiblioTech On Air. I'm Rosanna.
I'm Ruby.
And I'm Israel.
And today we have a special guest with us. Based here in San Antonio, artist, historian, and horticulturist Manuel Davila. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited. I've been meaning to make this happen for a while, and I was like, I'm just going to reach out.
Right.
Yeah, before we do have a set of questions to guide our discussion, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. Like I said, Manuel Davila, born and raised here in San Antonio, specifically the West Side. I am a little bit of everything. My main medium in artwork is watercolors. It used to be acrylic paints, but I've transitioned over during COVID, especially. I'm very blessed that my parents were very adamant about me learning my family history. And so I'm lucky enough to be able to trace my family lineage to the early 1650s,
Wow.
which is not very normal for most people. And so I'm very blessed that way that I get to talk about these things and like I have a history to look back on. Like I said, I was born and raised in the West Side, so I've got a lot of West Side pride.
Nice. Same.
I'm the oldest of four. I'm the first to be born here in the United States, completely American. I come from a long line of very thick-headed, opinionated, strong women, and they gave me a lot of talents and skills that I use today. I owe a lot of my success to them because they taught me everything I use every day for my artwork and my professional career. And so I got mad love for all the ladies in my family.
Nice.
And it's really my job or like my goal in life to give people support and agency to talk about their Indigenous backgrounds so they don't have as hard of a time discovering who they are. And so that my nephews and nieces, all the kids after me, have like an easier journey in discovering who they are and have, again, just more agency to be able to talk about their cultural heritage.
That's so awesome.
Yeah,
How did your family like keep track like that far back?
My dad has always been very adamant about us knowing all our grandmothers. One thing that's like my favorite catchphrase from him, he's got a lot of catchphrases. My dad.
As dads do.
Yes, they do. And even on Manuel Davila III, I'm named after my grandfather, just like my dad. So we have like a lot of pride in our name as well. Like the Davilas are a very close-knit group. And my dad was very adamant that we knew all our grandmothers because something he learned growing up was that if you don't know who you are, people are going to very quickly tell you who you are. And he didn't want that for us. You know, he grew up in a different time where, you know, as a dark-skinned person, he had to deal with a lot of like racism and just like microaggressions. And he knew that was going to happen to us too, but he at least wanted us to prepare us for those kind of situations and be able to enter those conversations with from a place of higher learning and also not feel like made less than or othered. So I'm very grateful to my dad giving us those like life lessons very early. And so, I can trace back my grandmas on both sides very, very far, which is funny because I can't trace my grandfathers very far. The women did a lot of the work in our family, which still is very adamant today. They, again, like the ladies in my family really hold it down together for us.
Wow.
Great to hear. Well, let's get right into these questions. So when did you first discover your passion for art and kind of what inspired you to pursue that career?
Well, the passion's always been there. My mother actually has my baby book in there. And in there, she wrote every day about my development for like the first 2 years. And in there, she writes about how much I like to draw and scribble. You know, I found pencils to be like the most magical thing in the world. It was all the fact that I could like scribble and like, what? This line's coming out of it. And anytime I could find a piece of paper or a big blank wall, man, I was going at that. I'm very probably a good thing that my grandfather was a painter because I would paint on our walls all the time. First chance I got, I was all, big blank canvas. So my parents very encouraging of the arts for me. So it started like since toddler. I have a few other artists in the family, but they don't think of themselves as artists. They just think of it as like their career.
I see.
So even though they don't think of it themselves as artists, I'm like, oh no, you do artisanía every day. I grew up in a floral store and a bridal store. We have a family bridal store and a floral store. So growing up and then being the firstborn too, was like I was always with my mom and her aunts, one of my great aunts. And all these ladies gave me free agency to play with whatever I wanted when I wanted. So growing up at the flower store, I got to make crazy bouquets and corsages and balloon arches and got access to tons of glitter and glue and glue sticks. And this is just amazing. And then in the other season, during wedding season, I got to work in the bridal store. my mom would switch between shops. And just growing up in this giant warehouse full of clouds of tulle and satin, like different fabrics, really let me kind of explore color palettes and fabrics and like the aesthetics of what make quinceañeras and weddings, what they are. And so, again, the women in my life gave me a lot to work with.
Great. It sounds like you were surrounded by creativity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they nurtured that 100%.
That is amazing. Yeah. And so, where do you find inspiration for your work?
Everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like my ADD sometimes is very hard to shut off. So sometimes I just get really hyper focused on things that I find, especially if it's a new talent or a new perspective on things that someone's exposing me to. I tend to get very, very almost hypnotized by it, and I want to just learn everything about it while I can. And especially when it comes to color theory, I love the idea of exploring the ways colors make people feel. The way that like colors help convey messages, like how it's used in commercial, and then also like in people's personal aesthetics. You know, everyone's got a favorite color. It's like very easy to pick one out. And like back in my school days, you know, you can find out everything about a person by looking at their binder. You know, so like who their best friends were, what was their favorite color, who was their favorite like cartoon character. So I think that like we like to leave little clues about people those kinds of ways, and I think even your favorite color tells a lot about yourself. And I've always like tried to study people, like, well, why is that your favorite color?
Yeah,
you know, like for my father himself, like his favorite color has always been very like cherry red. And I've always known that about him all my life, but I didn't think to ask him why until like I was a grown adult. I was like, why do you paint everything like cherry, sparkly red? He's like, oh, that was my first car. I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
And then my mom's obsessed with pink.
And her first car was pink.
Yeah,
first car was pink.
Yeah, it really was. And so I was like, oh, that's right. I remember the pink Cadillac. It was the pink satin interiors.
Oh, wow. Okay. It really was.
That's awesome.
Amazing. That's amazing. And are there any particular artists or like experiences or cultural elements that influence your work now?
I'm definitely inspired by the San Antonio River Basin, the Rio Grande area, which I grew up in. San Antonio's home base, but I like to tell people that I have lots of hometowns because my parents were missionaries, so we traveled through Central and South America a lot growing up. And so I've got lots of hometowns. So I tell people. My grandmother grew up on the other side of the Rio Grande River in Coahuila, in Piedras Negras. And she lived super close to the river. Like you could throw a stone into the river from her back porch.
Okay.
Wow.
And so it always kind of baffled me, this idea of like how much the world changes depending on what side of that river you're on.
Yeah.
And me, I have like really wonderful memories of growing up on that border and like ride my bike on that bridge. It's very different than it is now. It's super politicalized and militarized. But for me, I love that area because that's where I learned to like first have a lot of independence. My parents were very much just like, get out the door and go play.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't too concerned about, oh, something's bad gonna happen.
Yeah.
It was more like, oh, that's the world. You got to learn how to survive in it. And so growing up in all these like small rural towns, I always like went towards the colorful things. So I always loved artesanía. In Mexico, we'd go to all the fiestas and patrias. So any religious holiday, I was there. All my grandmothers always been like very close to the church. So I always ended up volunteering with them. And, you know, you put a group of old ladies together and they just make magic out of nothing.
For sure.
You know, it's like the queens of Rascuache. If there's nothing there pretty, they're going to make something pretty. So I've always had this kind of itch to make something pretty out of nothing. And then as I got older and I got a little bit more access to like supplies and like art materials, it really kind of just more expanded from that point. Start refining it a little bit more. My parents were very great about giving me access to art supplies. So even though we weren't like super rich or anything, they always made the arts a priority for me.
Yeah, that's great.
In middle school, I had a really, really, really wonderful art teacher, Miss Robin Guerra, who I'm still close with.
Good.
And she really encouraged my parents to encourage me to see the arts as in a professional way, not just something that's fun and keeps me out of trouble. And so she was a real bit advocate for me. And she actually convinced my parents to enroll me in this AC art program.
Nice.
And which was very different for my parents because even though they loved the arts for me, formal art institutions were kind of scary to them. This is not a place where we belonged.
Yeah.
Or anything. And so Miss Guerra really opened up this whole new door of like professional artistry to me, that I could make a career out of it and be successful at it. And it didn't just have to be like a hobby or just something that I just did in class. So I am an alumni from SAC, class of 94, 96. I don't remember right now. And that really opened not just me into the whole new world of art, professional art, but also my parents, because then they felt like they had a place within this world now too, and that they could take up space in formal art institutions and museums and galleries where they had always kind of felt like they didn't belong there because they didn't have the right background.
Yeah.
And now, as like a 36-year-old man, I get to go back to SAC as alumni and participate in the programs.
Yeah.
And that really opened up a lot of doors, like I said, for me, but also for my parents, because now we were able to have larger, broader conversations about art.
Yeah.
And they could see that it was a viable kind of career path for me and for like a lot of people in my family.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just us doing our jobs as painters or construction or house builders or florists. Like there was an artistry to it. And that they started realizing that we had evolved with San Antonio during their youth, my youth, growing up here, especially in the West Side. We got to see a lot of change, a lot of development. But they also got to show me that we still held on to our cultural roots.
Yeah.
And that's something that, you can't buy at a grocery store or like a department store.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely not.
Yeah. And so like there's always elements of culture that kind of survive, but they only survive because of the people who put it there and not through institutions or galleries.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, definitely.
You mentioned earlier that having art supplies being available to you. So I noticed something that you also do is you like extract or collect pigments from like the earth and river. Can you describe this process and its significance in your art?
Certainly. So my main medium now is watercolors. It used to be acrylic paints, but then I had this moment where I really started to critically look at the art that I was making, especially during COVID. Because I started to feel really guilty about all the paint that I had thrown away throughout the years and all the paintings that were just out in the world out there somewhere. Because acrylic paint is just latex, it's just plastic. And so I started really questioning myself. I was like, how is my art bettering the world? And is it just more damaging by all these paints and like supplies that I just ended up being thrown out, And during COVID, I really had a lot more time to focus on my art. Like everybody was trying to find something to do to keep you sane. And I started questioning what the processes were for watercolors. I always enjoyed watercolors, but I never thought of it as my main medium because I don't have as much control of them. Watercolors are going to do what they want to do. You can't force it. But it's also the beauty of watercolors. It gives you its own organic shape and form, and you have to work with it rather than work against it. And so for me, I really started developing this interest on natural dyeing. So I started just with things in my backyard. I started collecting things that I knew I could make natural dyes out of. Some of them are very common. We have a lot of them in our backyards. We just don't think of them that way anymore. And so that was the beginning of me starting to work more with the natural pigments. And then as I got more deeper into it, after the textile dyeing, I realized if I can dye textiles, then I can also make my own watercolors. And so then I started making my own watercolors. And then that kind of just kept evolving into using more natural minerals and products from plant materials. Eventually I got to ochre, which is an abundant natural resource all throughout the world. Everyone in the world has ochre. It's a naturally occurring mineral in the ground. But something really interesting about ochre is that small differences in the water quality, pollution, air quality affects it.
That's crazy.
So the pigment that I dig up from here in San Antonio River is not going to be the same that I dig up from San Marcos or New Braunfels.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Because all these little small differences in our environment make very big differences in its color and tint. And when I started playing with ochre, I started also realizing that these were San Antonio's first color palette. These are the colors that kind of adorned all of our ancestors' first clothing, all of our buildings. So even though there's a very limited palette, our colonial forefathers and foremothers were able to expand and give us a lot of vision through these very simple colors. And I think that the way that we have a lot of pride in like the Spurs or like our Texas flag, we show the same kind of respect for these colors because this was San Antonio's first color palette. And it's kind of showing my homage to like my ancestors, that these are the colors that have seen us throughout millennia. I work a lot with the San Antonio missions. I do tours of them, giving them tours from the indigenous perspective. And all of our frescoes that were once adorning the walls, you can still see some small instances where they still have survived. And I just think about how incredibly scientifically evolved our ancestors were, where they created this process that were able to create pigment and paints in order to adorn, again, themselves, their bodies, their jewelry, their walls. Because you got to think back, a couple thousand years, when your entire survival is based on your next meal, your next shelter, that creating art becomes a luxury. You have to give up, certain securities, certain number of your resources in order to make pigment and paint, just so that you could sit there and create something. And for me, that's when culture happens. When people went from the survivalist mode into this place where they were so in tune with the land and nature that they actually had time to rest and create art. And it's a very therapeutic process for me too, to create my own pigments out of minerals, because it is a very slow process. Nowadays, you can go to Walmart and get a color palette, 45 colors for less than $5. It's just that's awesome. But when you have to sit there and make your own pigment, it can take days for me to make just a thimble's worth of like red pigment. And to make that red pigment, I had to give up, obviously hours of my day. I had to make the sacrifice of trekking the river and going to harvest it. Anytime it comes in a solid rock form, so I have to grind that up into a very fine powder and then reconstitute it with gum arabic, a little bit of water, a little bit of oil, and a little bit of like essential oils to preserve it. It's a very slow process. Like to make a bottle cap's worth of pigment takes me 2 days.
Wow.
But that also has given me a lot of teachings in doing that process too, because when I think about how long it take me to make that bottle cap of pigment, the next thing I paint have to have a lot of meaning of it. I'm not just going to go draw anything random because it took me so much work to make that little bit of pigment. Whatever I put on rock or on paper, it has to be significant because of all the work that went behind it. And so it really helps me put myself in this like Neolithic place where my ancestors would have been. And it really made me feel much more connected to my ancestors. And it also kind of helped me understand the importance of rock art. They're not just symbols, sketched onto rocks out of boredom. These rock arts were created in order to convey message over long periods of time, that transcend even our ways of thinking today. The ideas that our ancestors were using pigments and creating basically celestial maps to know where they were to help the next person coming along. It was amazing, especially because in this day and age, I still get lost on my way home if I don't have my GPS on. But that my ancestors had such a profound understanding of where they were in the universe, on this land, that they could kind of create roadmaps just by drawing on a couple rocks so that they could always find their way back.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful process. It allows you to connect to your ancestors, and it gives that much more meaning to the work that you do. That is amazing. That's very beautiful. Yeah.
So you were recently selected to be the San Antonio River Authority and SACY's featured artist for Chican Month and unveiled a piece named Lightbox. Can you share the meaning of that piece and the experience you had being a featured artist?
Certainly. So that was a real full circle moment for me. Like I said, I'm alumni of SACY program. SACY had put out on their Instagram that they were looking for alumni to submit some proposals for the Chican Next Month exhibition. It's their first year doing this. And when I applied and I got selected, well, I didn't know I was selected yet. They wanted to do an interview. It kind of came up in our interview that I was the oldest person that submitted for it. That the call out for art was actually intended for their recent high school graduates. And I was a little scared, but I was also like, oh, please, if that's the case, let some other artists take it. I'm pretty good at my art career right now. I don't, let's support someone younger if this is what the intention was. And they were, I was a little like, oh my gosh, how old am I? But they were actually really thrilled about my proposal because I was very thorough. I've always been a bit of a nerd about preparing. Obviously, I've got lots of notes in front of me. And they liked the schematics that I drew out and sketched for them. Because I've always been I've always over prepared for things. And so I came up with this idea that I've been wanting to do for a while called Lightbox. It's a 7 foot by 7 foot cube that I would paint the panels on all 5 sides of it. And then from internally, there was a light factor inside of it. So it would glow in the dark at night. And then I also created a playlist with 2 hours worth of San Antonio Conjunto music that's based from this region. So that it could give people an essence of what these are the songs and stories that our grandparents listened to and partied to and danced to and probably fell in love with. And so I painted these 5 panels around the side of this cube, and then I installed it along the creek that runs right by CC's building. And it felt really wonderful to be able to bring that because it really felt like we were having a Sunday picnic on in this park, which I have lots of memories like that. My parents have always been very adamant about being outdoors, taking up a lot of space, and like really celebrating who we are and celebrating being a family together. And so be able to do it with a whole bunch of strangers, but them feeling like they were comfortable enough to like dance in a very public space with me felt really great. And then on the panels, I really try to paint things that were part of like the 78207, 78237, 78205 aesthetic. Like a lot of images that I know I grew up with. So on one side, I wrote the Dale Shine West Side. It's my dad's catchphase. He's always been like, oh, it's missing a little something, Dale a little shine.
I love it. That's great.
I drew a Virgen de Guadalupe on one other side because it's a big piece of like San Antonio iconography. Even if you aren't Catholic, growing up in this town, you learn to navigate Catholicism because it's in everything. On the other panel, I drew a set of waterbirds because waterbirds are a big part of our native tradition here. They've always been this kind of animal that I look to for a lot of indigenous teachings, and they also carry a lot of wisdom with themselves. They're migratory birds, and a real big reason why Spanish settlers chose Texas to settle was because of the abundance of water here. We have tons of artisanal natural springs, and waterbirds will always follow springs. They fly from one to the other, so they create paths for people to find the next source of water. And on the 4th panel, I did this San Antonio royalty image with the 4 Southern missions, because I always like to think that the missions were our first sign of community building. And these are the people who created San Antonio culture, not so much the Spanish, but the people that went into the church, that got converted into Catholicism. Because all the missions you visit here in San Antonio are built by indigenous people. That often gets overlooked because they give the Spanish all the credit for a lot of things. But all the labor and all the work of the stonemasonry was all built by indigenous hands. And I think that those are much more important stories to lift up, the communities that existed here before colonization. And also like giving them a little bit of praise. Everyone always knows the story of the Alamo, but they always forget the other 4 missions. And I'm a member of a number of the parishes of our mission. So I really wanted to give the elders who came to see the piece, I want them to see reflected themselves in it, that they are also part of this big story. It's more than just going to church. They've been able to keep a part of like our culture alive by being so devout in their religion.
You're really involved with the missions. Like you said, you give tours there. You really focus on being part of the parishes. So they play like a really big part for you.
Absolutely. They are a real big part of my cultural identity. I'm very blessed that I get to work for a nonprofit agency that supports my interest in the arts and also gives me access to a lot of history and anthropologists and archaeologists. So I work for American Indians in Texas at the Spanish Colonial Mission. It is the second largest and oldest Native American nonprofit agency in Texas. And something that makes them very special is that they can trace back their lineage to a Mission Indian descendant that was born and raised or built the missions. And these were San Antonio's first Catholics. They were the first people to convert it into Catholicism. And when we think back to pre-colonial days, like at first contact between the native people and the Spanish colonizers, we really have to understand like it was a very different dynamic at that time. The world was very different for them, but that they made a choice to enter the mission system. They knew that they were leaving their life of being free and free roaming the world and like living under the stars and entering these mission systems, which were very strict and had like a lot of rules. But they knew that their culture would survive. And I'm a benefit of that decision because they made the decision to enter the mission system. I now get to learn my culture. You know, they understood they were sacrificing parts of their culture by entering the mission system and becoming evangelized. But, you know, I'm very grateful for my great grandma that she did that because it allows me the opportunity to be here today. And it's very touching whenever I go to the missions because, again, that's a big way I connect my art. I'm walking on the same exact land that my great grandparents were. And these places carry a lot of cultural significance, again, even if you're not Catholic, because this is where San Antonio culture was really flourished and born. The San Antonio River fed into all those missions, into all those labores and fields. And that's where, you know, if it hadn't been for the indigenous people that populate these buildings, we probably would not have San Antonio today. They're the really ones that made the mission system work. And so there's a lot of pride that I take in when I visit the missions. That's a lot of the history that I want to share with people, especially through my art. That whenever you're entering these buildings, you know, even though they're only about 300 years old, as Native people, we have a recorded history that in this region that spans 15,000 years. And that's a much more encompassing and cooler narrative history to share with people. And really changes kind of the way that you think about Texas history. Very often when we think of history, we think about, well, when Spanish arrived in 1706, you know, it's like as if nothing happened in 1705, you know. In reality, we have had hundreds of thousands of tribes and bands and clans that live within this region that we now call San Antonio. And that they are really the ones that made San Antonio an habitable place. They had such a profound understanding of the land they lived on. They worked in harmony with it. They created the resources that we now kind of sometimes take for granted. You know, the natural resources that we have, the abundance of natural foods that grow here. Again, all the artisanal waters that we have here played a real big role as to why the Spanish even wanted to settle here. And those are all sciences that Native people created and kept alive. And so those are the stories I really try and tell through my art. It can be kind of difficult sometimes to talk about these things because some people just get hung up on the muckier parts of our history.
Right.
But for me in my art, I always want to come from a place of abundance. I would like to show people what we do have as Native people. We still have our stories. We still have some of our songs. We still have this idea that family is the most important thing that you can hold on to. And a lot of these things transcend, you know, time and space and is very much still part of San Antonio culture. And so, I mean, I get tons of outsiders that come take my tour for the first time and they're like, oh, I had no idea that Native even existed here. You know, I thought it was just all Mexicans. It's like, oh, well, you're not alone with that. We learned that a lot too.
You are in for a big storm.
I was like, everyone's indigenous in some place, but you have to do the research to figure out what it is.
That's so beautiful. Like next time I go to the missions, that's just going to be a completely different perspective I take walking through there.
Well, next time we'll go on a tour with you. Hopefully.
Please do.
I would love to do that. That sounds amazing. So what's some advice you would give to like an aspiring artist on the younger side, especially those who are trying to find their voice and their style?
I tell everyone, young and old, just start. You know, we very often we get kind of lost in the preparation of being artists. I need to have a website and I need to have business cards and I need to have this and I don't have a big enough following. In reality, those things are the smallest part about being an artist. The hardest part is getting started. You don't know what your style is until you start. And it takes a lot of hit and misses before you can develop what your taste and what your style and your technique is. So make all the mistakes that you can right now, because that's really the beautiful thing about art. There's no real rules to it. There's no right or wrong. It's basically an expression of your feelings.
Yeah.
And you can't ever tell your feelings that they're wrong. They're yours.
Yeah.
Own them. So the hardest part is like always going to be looking at the blank page, that blank canvas staring back is always the scariest part. But it's also the most thrilling part, because you don't have that kind of fear in everyday life. It's a very different kind of idea of like, it's the overwhelming of opportunity that you're staring at. And so take that opportunity, and realize that you are already an artist. It's not something that you become overnight or someone gives you a medal or a badge. No, like, oh, you're officially an artist now.
Yeah.
You are an artist because you claim to be an artist. That's all it takes.
Beautiful. Yeah, definitely.
So looking ahead, what are some of your goals and or any upcoming projects that you can share with us?
So I've got 3 more art shows planned for 2025. The city has asked me to participate again in their Culture Commons exhibition for the UNESCO 10-year anniversary. I'll be doing an installation piece for Centro de Artes come late next fall, 2025. And then I do intend to create another space to create some art along the San Antonio River. All my programs are always free. I love forcing people to interact with my art. It's a real big practice for me. I don't like the idea that art is not something that you're supposed to touch or just walk past, For me, the best part of art is interacting with it, having other people interact with it and seeing how it makes them feel, what they see in it. So I always try and create spaces that people feel comfortable enough to come approach my art, talk about it, give me their own experience about it. And then also for them to try it as well.
Yeah.
And, give their own spin. So I'll have a couple more exhibitions coming up this coming year. I frequently do classes where I just kind of teach younger children the process and how I work with watercolors, and make my own pigments. I do a lot of natural eco dyeing. And then I'm always available on Instagram. I love to talk about horticulture with people. I love talking about plants and hierbas and learning the medicinal and, other household uses for plants. So anytime I'm ever in public, I love to have straight conversations with people about like, what plants do you like? It's always like the easiest thing to ask people. And so there's quite a few opportunities for me. Like I said, I also do tours at San Antonio Missions through my agency, AIT. And I get to work with National Park Service quite a bit because of that. So I'm pretty accessible all throughout San Antonio.
Nice.
So quick question, going back to like, you're extracting and process of, using nature. You mentioned that you would travel a lot, like, in your youth, kind of go through Central and South America. Have you had a chance to like go back to those areas and just like do the dye process, making your own pigments too? Or is that something that maybe that's down on your radar, like further down?
It's definitely has happened a couple times, not too much. I'm very blessed though that I have a lot of friends that travel too. And so whenever people are going out of state or out of town or out of the country, the first thing I ask for is like, bring me back a rock.
Awesome.
I'm all like, bring me some dirt. That's all. T-shirts are great and all that, but like, bring me some dirt. It's the only thing I can work with, some clay.
Literal jar of dirt.
Yeah, and it's worked a couple times. I had a friend that traveled to Egypt, and she brought me back some mineral samples from there. I made lots of friends with park rangers, and every time they find something kind of interest, they'll call me, and I'll like, Manuel, look at what I got. I'm like,
nice.
That is awesome.
So
that is so.
And
cool.
again, that's the beautiful thing about art. It creates bigger conversations for us to all have. And even though we're just talking about soil and dirt, it's all like, oh, we have a lot to build on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice.
Well, we are a library, right? So we like to end on a question. What are you currently reading, or what have you just recently finished?
So currently reading, I just finished The Midnight Library.
Oh, okay.
That was
New
a
York
fun
Best
read.
Time Seller. It was really good. I liked that
Yeah.
one a lot. And then I just also finished Janelle Monáe's book. And the next on my list is to read Michelle Obama's book, which is waiting for me for a little while.
Are you a fan of Janelle Monáe?
I am. I'm a big fan.
What do you think of her last album, The Age of Pleasure?
It was definitely not going to let my nephews and nieces listen to that one until a little bit older.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more of adult theme. But I do like this futuristic sci-fi spin she takes on all of her work. Like what is art and music going to look like in the future. Definitely our lifetime, but kind of like aspiring to something a little bit different.
Which we have Janelle's music on Hoopla, by the way. So make sure y'all go check that out.
Alrighty.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us here. Manuel, thank you so much for joining us today. Such a great, insightful conversation.
Yes,
My goodness. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Had a great time.
Good.
We'd love to hear that for sure. But make sure y'all catch this episode soon. And I'm Rosanna.
I'm Ruby.
And I'm Israel.
Bye.